There's a particular kind of adrenaline that courses through certain people, not the fight or flight panic that freezes you in genuine danger, but the controlled rush that comes from facing manufactured threats in digital spaces where death means restarting from the last typewriter. It's the physiology of people who fought their way through Raccoon City streets, not as tourists sampling an action game, but as survivors who discovered something in the chaos they couldn't name until they found themselves loading a shotgun with 3 shells left, no healing items, and a hallway full of zombies between them and safety. This is the reality for millions of people who don't just play Resident Evil. They chase it, they master it, they defend it, they see themselves reflected not in broken mirrors and psychological torment, but in the satisfaction of perfect inventory management and the triumph of surviving against overwhelming odds. You might assume these are simply action game enthusiasts, people who enjoy tight gunplay and appreciate polished mechanics. But that assumption misses something vital about what Resident Evil does to certain minds, and more importantly, what certain minds bring to Resident Evil. The psychology behind loving Resident Evil is far more complex than preference or fandom. It's a web of personal resilience, competence validation, and a deep hunger for challenges that acknowledge difficulty without flinching. Understanding this psychology reveals something fundamental about human courage itself, how we seek controlled danger in fiction to prove something about ourselves, how we find validation and mastery over threats that would destroy us in reality, and how a video game series about surviving bioterror outbreaks became a proving ground for people who need to demonstrate they're capable of handling whatever comes. When researchers study the appeal of action horror media, they discover something fascinating. The brain of someone who deeply connects with mastery-based survival horror doesn't just enjoy being scared. It's actually seeking validation for competence that daily life rarely demands. Neural pathways associated with problem solving under pressure light up. The areas responsible for strategic thinking and resource optimization become hyperactive. It's as if the mind, starved of meaningful challenges where skill produces tangible results, finally finds something that speaks its language. This isn't entertainment in the simple sense, it's validation, it's proving capability. But how does someone become a Resident Evil devotee in the first place? The path to this particular form of love rarely happens with passive exposure. It's usually a collision between a moment of doubt about one's own capabilities and a challenge that seems insurmountable. Maybe it started with barely surviving the first zombie encounter in the original game, heart pounding, hands shaking, then realizing the rush of having faced something terrifying and prevailed. Perhaps it was finally defeating Nemesis after the 20th attempt, that moment when pattern recognition clicked and skill overcame seemingly impossible odds. Or it might have been completing Resident Evil on the hardest difficulty with no deaths, that proof of absolute mastery, hitting someone at exactly the moment they needed to demonstrate to themselves that they were capable of more than they believed. Each of these experiences creates what psychologists call competence affirmation. The brain begins to associate Resident Evil not with entertainment but with proof of capability. With each game, with each higher difficulty conquered, the connection strengthens. The zombie-filled hallways become testing grounds. The resource scarcity becomes a puzzle with optimal solutions. The boss battles become skill checks that separate those who've mastered the systems from those who haven't. Resident Evil becomes a language for demonstrating things that have no other outlet. This creates protective mechanisms around the franchise itself. When someone criticizes Resident Evil's increasingly action-focused direction, its departure from pure horror, its emphasis on reflexes over atmosphere, Fans don't just disagree, they defend these elements as essential. The tight combat isn't pandering to action fans, it's respect for player skill. The resource management isn't artificial limitation, it's meaningful decision making. The escalating difficulty isn't poor balance, it's the actual challenge of proving you're good enough. These aren't conscious rationalizations. They're automatic responses designed to protect something that has become psychologically necessary. Over time, these protective mechanisms become invisible barriers between Resident Evil fans and other gaming communities. When someone says Silent Hill is better because it has deeper themes, Resident Evil fans hear an invalidation of their own approach to horror. When someone complains that the later games are too action focused, fans hear someone dismissing the value of skill expression and mechanical mastery. They start interpreting neutral gaming criticism as personal attacks because Resident Evil has become intertwined with their sense of capability. There's another layer to this psychology that's often overlooked. People who love Resident Evil frequently develop an intense relationship with optimization and efficiency. When external validation for their competence has been limited, proving capability through mastery becomes essential. They speedrun sections endlessly, not just for times, but for perfection. They scrutinize every inventory configuration for optimal efficiency. They memorize enemy placements, item locations, and unlock conditions. They create elaborate strategies for resource conservation and damage routing. This optimization obsession becomes both achievement and compulsion. It's a space where they can engage with challenge intellectually rather than just reactively, maintaining enough control to demonstrate skill while still acknowledging the difficulty. But it's also a space where standards can become impossibly rigid. Without casual players to provide perspective on what constitutes reasonable difficulty, their understanding of Resident Evil can become increasingly demanding and elitist. The games become mirrors showing only their own mastery, which is precisely why they're so powerful, but also why discourse becomes so competitive. The irony is that many people who love Resident Evil possess exceptional strategic thinking and adaptability under pressure. They've spent so much time analyzing optimal strategies through the lens of these games that they often understand crisis management better than people with formal training. They can assess threat priorities instantly. They notice when resource expenditure doesn't match threat level. They recognize patterns in chaos that others consider overwhelming. But this heightened capability becomes a double-edged sword. When you can see optimal paths through every challenge and recognize inefficiency in every approach that doesn't match your standards, it becomes harder to enjoy anything that doesn't respect your skill level. You become intolerant of games that handhold, that provide too many resources, that don't punish mistakes meaningfully. The patience required for games that don't challenge you feels like wasted time, but explaining why becomes exhausting when everyone around you seems content with easier experiences. The psychology of loving Resident Evil also affects how these individuals view themselves. Without the mirror of an appropriately challenging community to reflect their achievements back to them, they often develop distorted self-images based entirely on their relationship to the franchise. They identify as Resident Evil fans first, gamers second, everything else after. They convince themselves they're too hardcore, too skilled, too demanding for casual gaming communities. This self-perception becomes a lens through which they interpret every interaction within gaming spaces. When someone expresses admiration for their skill, they can't believe it's genuine. They assume the person is mocking them, or they're exaggerating, or they'll eventually reveal they actually think Resident Evil is too hard and therefore bad. This skepticism, while born from past dismissals by people who couldn't handle the difficulty, sabotages present opportunities for connection. What makes this particularly ironic is that people who love Resident Evil often crave recognition more intensely than casual players. They've experienced the profound satisfaction that comes from genuine achievement, so they understand the value of earned respect in ways others take for granted. They don't want participation trophies or casual praise. They hunger for the kind of recognition where skill is acknowledged without qualification, where they can reference frame perfect dodges and optimal routing and be understood, where they're truly known in their relationship to mastery. This craving for recognition of competence over accessibility means they often reject opportunities for broader community interactions that could potentially develop into something more meaningful over time. They want to skip the casual player conversations and dive straight into advanced strategy discussions about knife only runs or no damage speed runs. But most community building needs time to establish baseline respect and mutual understanding. The rush to prove capability can alienate potential peers who need to work up to that level of engagement. The adaptation to this particular form of fandom also changes how they experience challenge and achievement. Without shared experiences of struggling through their first playthrough, their relationship to their own initial failures becomes complicated. They might struggle to help newcomers because they can't recreate that first blind experience, or they might fixate on coaching others through optimal strategies, living vicariously through each new player's learning curve, seeking to witness that moment of breakthrough they remember so powerfully. Their relationship with the franchise becomes multi layered. On one hand, they've learned to find deep satisfaction in its challenge because they've had to. They've developed sophisticated understanding of enemy behavior, resource economics, and risk assessment. But this comfort with the franchise can also become limiting. The longer they remain in Resident Evil communities, the more foreign other gaming spaces feel. The more foreign they feel, the more anxious they become about engaging with other genres, and the more anxious they become, the more they retreat into familiar challenges. The cycle deepens when they realize how much social capital they've built exclusively around Resident Evil mastery. Conversations that once felt natural now require conscious effort to avoid franchise references. They second guess sharing opinions about other games, overthink their engagement with other action titles, and analyze every gaming discussion for signs that they're too narrowly focused. What used to be passionate expertise becomes something that feels like limitation. This psychology also changes their relationship with success and failure. Every new Resident Evil entry triggers a complex emotional response. Hope that maybe this time the difficulty will be properly balanced to challenge them. Fear that it'll be dumbed down for casual audiences. Anticipation about what new mechanics might test their skills. Concern that beloved systems might be streamlined away. This isn't the simple anticipation of a new entry in a favorite series. It's a test of whether their capabilities will be respected or patronized. When Resident Evil 6 overloaded players with resources and made combat feel loose and imprecise, it wasn't just disappointment, it felt like the franchise had stopped respecting skill. When Resident Evil 5 emphasized co op over solo mastery, it wasn't just a design choice, it felt like achievement was being diluted. When the remake smoothed out the original game's rough edges while adding modern accessibility features, it wasn't just updating. It felt like the barriers that made victory meaningful were being lowered. These reactions seem disproportionate to outsiders, but they make perfect sense when you understand that Resident Evil isn't just entertainment for these people, it's validation of their capability. There's another fascinating dimension to this psychology regarding the relationship with Resident Evil's resource management. For many devotees, the inventory system exists as a puzzle completely separate from the horror. They engage with the attaché case not as a limitation but as an optimization challenge that captures specific strategic thinking they excel at. When they're planning weapon loadouts, they reach for certain configurations. When they're managing healing items, different strategies emerge. The weapons represent their offensive capability. The healing items hold their margin for error. The key items create pressure for efficiency. The resource management becomes a strategic vocabulary that allows them to express competence that would otherwise remain undemonstrated. This creates an interesting paradox. Many people who love Resident Evil describe the resource management as satisfying or rewarding, which seems contradictory for systems designed to create tension. But it makes perfect sense from a psychological perspective. These systems represent agency. They're proof that smart planning and efficient execution matter. Someone else faced the same scarce resources and failed. You succeeded. The scarcity isn't frustrating, it's validating. Someone else understood the strategic depth. Someone else felt the satisfaction of perfect optimization. Someone else knew that meaningful challenge requires meaningful constraints. The psychology of achievement also manifests in how Resident Evil fans engage with horror as a genre. They become connoisseurs of specific types of fear, not atmospheric dread or psychological horror, but adrenaline pumping threat response and survival tension. They can articulate exactly why certain horror works and others fail. They understand that the scariest thing isn't the monster's design, but whether you have the resources and skill to handle it. That true tension comes from fair but demanding challenges rather than cheap surprises. That the most effective horror builds through resource attrition rather than scripted scares. This expertise creates both connection and distance within horror communities. They find kindred spirits among people who appreciate Dead Space, The Evil Within, and other skill based survival horror, experiences that operate on similar mechanical wavelengths as Resident Evil, but they also find themselves frustrated by horror fans who only want atmospheric experiences, who complain when a game requires mechanical skill or resource optimization. The challenge required for meaningful horror feels natural to them, but explaining why becomes exhausting. The mirror and the meditation, what Silent Hill fans reveal about Resident Evil devotees. Perhaps nowhere is the psychology of Resident Evil fans more clearly illuminated than when compared to people who prefer Silent Hill. These two franchises emerged in the same era, on the same console, both labeled survival horror, yet they attracted fundamentally different types of people. Understanding this divide reveals something crucial about what Resident Evil offers that nothing else does, and more importantly, what type of person needs that specific offering. Silent Hill fans, broadly speaking, engage with horror as internal confrontation. They need fear that reflects psychological damage, that validates trauma, that treats suffering as something to be witnessed rather than overcome. The horror in Silent Hill is permanent and personal. You can't defeat your guilt. The town will always manifest your demons. There's no final victory, just varying degrees of acceptance or denial. This appeals to a psychology that has experienced powerlessness and needs art that acknowledges some wounds don't heal. Silent Hill tells you that problems don't always have solutions, that action doesn't guarantee results, and that sometimes survival means carrying weight forever. These are psychologically destabilizing truths, which is why Silent Hill remains niche compared to Resident Evil's broader appeal. Resident Evil fans, by contrast, engage with horror as external challenge. They enjoy the tension of resource scarcity, the satisfaction of executed strategies, the triumph of surviving through skill. The horror in Resident Evil is external and defeatable. Zombies can be killed efficiently. Umbrella Corporation can be exposed and dismantled. Wesker can be stopped through superior tactics. There's always a final boss, always an escape, always closure achieved through capability. The player becomes competent through mastery. Learn the optimal strategies. Manage your resources efficiently. Execute your skills precisely, and you prevail. This appeals to a psychology that finds validation in agency and competence. Resident Evil tells you that problems, even horrific ones, can be solved through skill and preparation. The world is dangerous but ultimately fair. There are threats and survivors. Evil has identifiable sources: corporations, mad scientists, bioterrorists. Action produces measurable results. The trained operative, or the player who has become trained through practice, prevails. These are psychologically stabilizing messages, which is perhaps why Resident Evil has maintained mainstream popularity even as it evolved toward action. The distinction becomes even clearer when examining what each fan base criticizes about the other franchise. Silent Hill fans often describe Resident Evil as shallow, as action schlock with B-movie plots. They complain about the straightforward stories, the heroic protagonists, the explosive endings. These complaints reveal that they're approaching Resident Evil with Silent Hill's metrics, expecting psychological complexity, symbolic depth, emotional ambiguity. When Resident Evil doesn't provide these things, they experience it as insufficiency rather than different purpose. Resident Evil fans, meanwhile, describe Silent Hill as too slow, too pretentious, too abstract. They criticize the clunky combat, the obtuse puzzles, the deliberate withholding of clear objectives. These criticisms reveal that they're approaching Silent Hill with Resident Evil's metrics, expecting agency, mastery, progression, skill demonstration, and achievement. When Silent Hill doesn't provide these things, they experience it as failure rather than intention. Neither group is wrong, exactly. They're just revealing what they need from horror media, which in turn reveals something about their psychological relationship with fear itself. Resident Evil fans need horror they can defeat because that provides validation and reinforces their sense of capability. They enjoy being scared, but they need that fear to lead to triumph through demonstrated skill. The game says, yes, the world contains terrible things, but you are capable of handling them if you're good enough. This is a psychologically empowering message that allows them to engage with horror as achievement. Silent Hill fans need horror they can't defeat because that provides recognition of permanent damage. They need fear that lingers because that matches experiences that didn't resolve. They don't want triumph, they want acknowledgement. The game says, yes, the world contains terrible things, and sometimes you can't overcome them, and that's the reality you carry. This is a psychologically validating message that allows them to engage with horror as witness. The protagonist difference is particularly telling. Leon Kennedy, Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, these are capable people who become more capable through experience. They're trained operatives or quickly develop combat skills. They rise to challenges. Players embody competence with room for growth. When bad things happen to these characters, it's because of external evil, bioterrorism, corporate greed, mad science. The characters themselves remain fundamentally heroic. Their trauma is situational and processable. They continue fighting. They develop PTSD, but they also develop coping mechanisms. Their struggle is about maintaining their humanity while becoming effective enough to stop the threats. James Sunderland, Angelo Roscoe, Harry Mason. These are broken people drawn to a town that manifests their internal damage. They're not trained. They don't develop competence. They endure. Players embody vulnerability without meaningful progression. When bad things happen to these characters, it's often because they caused those things or failed to prevent them. The characters themselves are complicit in their suffering. Their trauma is fundamental to who they are. Resident Evil fans can aspire to the characters they play as. Silent Hill fans recognize themselves in the characters they play as. This distinction matters enormously. One franchise offers aspirational gameplay, become capable enough to survive. The other offers confessional gameplay, admit what you carry. These appeal to fundamentally different psychological needs. The ending structures reveal the same divide. Resident Evil typically offers endings based on performance. Did you save everyone? Did you complete objectives efficiently? Did you demonstrate sufficient skill? The endings are rewards for gameplay achievement. Silent Hill offers multiple endings based on emotional choices. Did you prioritize finding your wife or protecting another person? Did you maintain your health or neglect it? Did you examine items suggesting self-harm? The endings reflect psychological state. Resident Evil fans enjoy optimization. They speed run for better ranks. They perfect strategies for S plus rankings. They memorize routes for efficiency. The games reward mastery, and mastery feels validating. It provides sense of control and proven capability. Silent Hill fans often don't even know which ending they're heading toward until it happens. They're not optimizing, they're expressing. The game responds to who they were during that playthrough rather than how well they played. This extends to how each fan base engages with difficulty settings. Resident Evil fans often play on the hardest difficulties for the challenge and the achievement. Successfully completing Resident Evil 2 Remake on hardcore is a badge of honor that demonstrates skill. It's something to be proud of. Silent Hill fans often don't engage with difficulty in the same way. The mechanical challenge isn't what matters. Playing Silent Hill 2 on easy versus hard doesn't significantly change whether the psychological themes resonate. The community dynamics differ correspondingly. Resident Evil communities bond over shared accomplishments, difficult sections conquered, speed run times compared, optimal strategies debated, challenge runs completed. There's a competitive yet celebratory energy. We achieved this together. We all proved we could handle it. We mastered the system. Silent Hill communities bond over shared damage. Similar traumas recognized. Symbolic interpretations compared. Emotional impacts shared. There's a memorial energy. We suffered this together. We witnessed each other. Neither community dynamic is inherently superior, but they serve completely different psychological functions. Resident Evil communities build collective efficacy, the sense that together we are capable and can prove it. Silent Hill communities build collective recognition, the sense that together we are seen and understood. People are drawn to whichever type of community addresses their core psychological need. The relationship with horror violence illustrates another fascinating division. Resident Evil features explicit but functional violence, heads exploding from headshots, limbs severing from shotgun blasts, blood spattering as immediate feedback for successful hits. This violence serves clear mechanical purposes: visual confirmation of damage, telegraphing weak points, satisfaction of effective threat elimination. The violence is against the player but also available to the player. You can efficiently destroy the thing that's threatening you. There's satisfaction in that, a sense of fighting back effectively against horror. Silent Hill features symbolic violence, Angela's monster being sexually traumatic imagery, James's monsters having feminine features suggesting his sexual frustration and guilt, ritualistic violence representing psychological damage. This violence isn't about mechanical feedback, but psychological recognition. You can defeat these monsters, but you can't destroy what they represent. There's no satisfaction in it, only exhaustion and temporary reprieve. Resident Evil fans appreciate the clarity of violence. They enjoy the arsenal of weapons, the different tactical applications, the ability to fight back effectively. The game respects their desire to defend themselves and rewards efficient aggression. Silent Hill fans often actively avoid combat because fighting externalized trauma feels pointless and draining. The game respects their desire to simply endure and move forward. The tone difference matters significantly. Resident Evil maintains a certain heightened action movie quality even in its most serious entries. Larger than life villains deliver dramatic monologues. Action sequences feature impossible feats of combat prowess. One liners punctuate tense moments. There's a deliberate distance between the player and genuine emotional vulnerability. You're starring in a horror action movie that you control. The heightened tone provides psychological distance. It's intense and challenging, but it's also kind of badass, which makes it safe to engage with fully. Silent Hill maintains a depressive realism even in its most fantastical moments. Conversations feel awkward and emotionally stunted. Characters seem genuinely damaged and traumatized. Symbolism is never explained away or made safe through ironic distance. You're not performing, you're implicated. The game refuses to provide psychological distance. It's disturbing and it wants to disturb you because disturbance is how recognition happens. People who need horror to be empowering, at least in the sense of rewarding skill and validating capability, gravitate toward Resident Evil. People who need horror to be meaningful, in the sense of psychologically significant and personally relevant, gravitate towards Silent Hill. These aren't moral categories. Needing empowerment isn't shallow, and needing meaning isn't superior. They're just different psychological relationships with fear and capability. The franchise trajectories reveal how each has had to navigate changing audience expectations. When Resident Evil shifted toward action in RE4 and RE5, many old school fans complained about losing the survival horror roots, but the games achieved massive commercial success. The franchise discovered that most people prefer horror that's exciting and skill testing over horror that's oppressive and resource constrained. When Silent Hill attempted to add more action in Homecoming and Downpour, both underperformed. The franchise discovered that its specific audience doesn't want empowerment through combat. They want recognition through symbolism. This created an interesting divergence. Resident Evil survived by becoming more of what broader audiences wanted: tighter action, more resources, clearer objectives, while occasionally returning to pure survival horror for specific entries like RE7 and the remakes. It maintained relevance by evolving with player skill expectations and mechanical standards. Silent Hill couldn't survive the same way because its audience is more purist and much smaller. You can't grow a niche audience by making it less niche. You just alienate the people who needed that specific thing. The relationship with replay value operates differently. Resident Evil games are endlessly replayable for mechanical reasons: speedrun optimization, unlockable weapons and modes, different character routes, achievement hunting, challenge runs. Each replay is about improving performance or testing new constraints. You're playing the game more skillfully or under more demanding conditions. Silent Hill games are selectively replayable for emotional reasons, returning when you're in a specific headspace, or years later when your relationship to the themes has changed, or to see different endings that reflect different psychological states. Each replay is about engaging with your own evolution. You're not playing the game more skillfully, you're bringing a different self to it. Resident Evil fans will often describe their favorite entry as the most balanced mechanically, the most satisfying to master, or the most rewarding to optimize. Silent Hill fans describe their favorite entry as the most personally significant or the most emotionally devastating. These metrics don't translate across fan bases. A Resident Evil fan hearing Silent Hill 2 destroyed me emotionally might think, why would you want that? A Silent Hill fan hearing RE4 has perfect game feel and is endlessly replayable might think, but what does it all mean? The comparison ultimately reveals that loving Resident Evil requires a specific kind of psychological orientation or psychological need, depending on perspective. It requires being in a place where proving capability matters more than processing damage, where demonstrating skill matters more than being witnessed, where achieving victory matters more than accepting defeat. This isn't superior to loving Silent Hill, it's different, but it does explain why Resident Evil fans can seem so competitive, so achievement focused, so unwilling to accept criticism that treats the games as merely another example of survival horror. They're not defending a game franchise. They're defending the thing that validated their capability when nothing else did. And when someone says Silent Hill is better because it has deeper meaning, what Resident Evil fans hear is, your need for achievement is less valid than someone else's need for recognition. When someone says Resident Evil is too action focused now, what fans hear is, your desire for challenging skill expression isn't a legitimate way to engage with horror. This is why the debates between fan bases so often feel hostile and unresolvable. They're not actually debating game quality, they're defending completely different psychological needs, and neither side can fully understand the other without acknowledging that horror serves different purposes for different people. For some, it's recognition that processes trauma through witnessing. For others, it's validation that processes doubt through achievement. Both are legitimate, both matter, but they'll never agree on which franchise is better because they're not actually playing the same kind of game, even when both are labeled survival horror. Understanding this divide helps explain why Resident Evil fans are the way they are. They're not shallow for preferring mechanical depth, they need it. They're not elitist when they demand proper difficulty, they're protecting something that can't be protected any other way. They're not overthinking optimization strategies. They're using the only language available for demonstrating capabilities that otherwise remain unproven. And they're not wrong for being competitive about games that most people consider entertainment. They're responding appropriately to games that performed psychological work nothing else could. The person who prefers Silent Hill isn't psychologically damaged beyond repair. They just have specific wounds that require specific medicine. The person who needs Resident Evil isn't psychologically superior or healthier. They just have different capabilities they need validated, or different doubts they need to overcome. Both franchises offer horror, but one offers horror as challenge to be mastered, and one offers horror as wound to be witnessed. And the type of person you are determines which of those you need. The competence hypothesis, why some minds need Resident Evil. There's a psychological theory that might explain why certain people gravitate toward Resident Evil with such intensity that it transcends typical fandom. It's called the competence hypothesis, and while it wasn't developed specifically for video games, it maps onto the Resident Evil experience with unsettling precision. The theory suggests that humans have a fundamental psychological need to feel capable and effective in their environment. When this need goes unmet in daily life, when jobs feel meaningless, when efforts produce no visible results, when competence remains undemonstrated, the psyche begins seeking alternative spaces where capability can be proven and validated. Resident Evil provides exactly this space. Every bullet counts because resources are limited. Every decision matters because mistakes compound. Every encounter tests whether you've learned enemy patterns, managed resources efficiently, planned your route effectively. The game doesn't care about your intentions or your potential. It cares about execution. Did you conserve enough ammunition? Did you heal at the right moment? Did you recognize the optimal strategy? These are questions with objective answers, and getting them right produces tangible results, survival, progress, achievement. For people whose daily lives offer few opportunities for this kind of concrete validation, Resident Evil becomes psychologically necessary. It's not that they're escaping reality, they're seeking reality. In a world where most work produces abstract results measured in emails sent or spreadsheets updated, successfully navigating the Spencer Mansion with minimal resources represents accomplishment that feels authentic. You proved something measurable. Your capability produced a result that couldn't have been achieved without it. This explains something that confuses outsiders: why Resident Evil fans often seem more invested in the mechanical system than the narrative. It's not that they don't care about story. Many can recite detailed lore about Umbrella Corporation, the various bioweapon projects, and the complex timeline spanning multiple games. But the mechanical systems are where the psychological work happens. Resource management proves planning capability. Combat execution proves reflexes and pattern recognition. Speed running proves mastery and optimization. These aren't peripheral to the experience. They are the experience for minds seeking competence validation. The original Resident Evil, released in 1996, codified many of the mechanics that would define the franchise's appeal: tank controls that required precise input, fixed camera angles that demanded spatial awareness, extremely limited inventory space forcing constant strategic decisions, scarce ammunition requiring careful shot placement, ink ribbons that made saving itself a resource requiring management. These weren't limitations of the hardware, though they certainly exploited it. They were design choices that created meaningful challenge where skill expression mattered and carelessness was punished. For players who connected with this design philosophy, it was revelatory. Here was a game that didn't hold your hand, that expected you to learn and adapt, that respected your intelligence enough to let you fail. When you died in Resident Evil, it was because you made mistakes, poor resource allocation, inefficient routing, panic shooting, failing to learn enemy patterns. The game was fair but demanding, and that combination created space for genuine achievement. Surviving wasn't guaranteed. It required capability, and proving the capability felt meaningful in ways few other games offered. The psychological impact deepened with subsequent entries. Resident Evil 2 expanded the formula with branching scenarios and multiple protagonists, creating replay value that rewarded mastery. Players discovered that a fresh-faced Leon Kennedy arrives in Raccoon City on his first day as a police officer, completely unprepared for bioterror outbreak. Claire Redfield comes searching for her brother, equally untrained for combat. Both characters develop competence through the player's growing skill. This parallel progression, character and player both becoming more capable, creates powerful psychological bonding. You're not just controlling Leon, you're embodying his journey from terrified rookie to survivor. Resident Evil 3 introduced Nemesis, a persistent threat that couldn't be permanently defeated until the final confrontation, stalking Jill Valentine throughout Raccoon City. This added a new psychological dimension, sustained pressure that tested not just individual encounters but continuous performance under stress. Players had to maintain composure, make real time decisions about fighting versus fleeing, manage resources while being hunted. For people whose daily lives lack this kind of stakes and immediate consequence, the Nemesis encounters provided simulated high pressure situations where their decision making ability mattered enormously. Code Veronica added complexity to combat and exploration, requiring more sophisticated strategic thinking. Resident Evil Zero introduced a partner system where resource management extended across two characters, creating multi-dimensional optimization challenges. Each entry refined the formula while maintaining the core principle: your capability determines your outcome. Then came Resident Evil 4 in 2005, which fundamentally transformed the franchise while maintaining its psychological appeal to competence seeking minds. The shift to over the shoulder perspective and more action focused combat alarmed purists who feared the franchise was abandoning survival horror. But what actually happened was more nuanced. RE4 didn't abandon the competence validation that made Resident Evil psychologically powerful. It evolved it for players whose reflexes and pattern recognition had been honed by years of action games. RE4 maintained resource scarcity, but added precise aiming mechanics that rewarded skillful shooting. It kept inventory management, but made it a spatial puzzle through the attaché case system. It preserved overwhelming odds, but gave players tools to fight back effectively if they executed properly. The result was a game that validated capability through different mechanics than the originals while maintaining the same psychological principle: get good enough and you prevail. For fans whose competence needs were specifically met through strategic resource management and methodical survival, RE4 felt like betrayal. But for players whose competence needs centered on reflexes, precision, and tactical combat, RE4 was perfection. This split the fan base not because one group was right and the other wrong, but because they were seeking validation for different types of capability. Both are legitimate, both matter psychologically, but they can't coexist perfectly in a single game design. Resident Evil 5 doubled down on the action direction, emphasizing co op gameplay and providing relatively generous resources. This alienated survival horror purists even further while attracting players who found validation through teamwork and combat execution. RE6 pushed even harder toward action spectacle, creating a divisive entry that many hardcore fans consider the franchise's low point. But even RE6, for all its mechanical bloat and confused design, maintained something essential. It was challenging. It demanded skill execution. Casual players struggled with its complexity. And for a subset of fans, that difficulty, however messily implemented, still provided competence validation. The franchise course corrected with Resident Evil 7 in 2017, returning to pure survival horror with first-person perspective, resource scarcity, and emphasis on dread over action. This was a fascinating psychological moment for the fan base. Fans who'd been alienated by the action-heavy entries celebrated the return to form. But fans who'd connected with the action era felt abandoned, as if the franchise was rejecting the specific capabilities they'd developed. Neither group was wrong. They were defending different competence validations. RE7 introduced Ethan Winters, an ordinary man searching for his missing wife who stumbles into bioterror nightmare. Unlike the trained operatives and hardened survivors who populated earlier entries, Ethan is deliberately portrayed as incompetent initially. His breathing becomes labored under stress. His aim is shaky. His commentary reveals genuine terror. The psychological impact for players is complex. Some found it refreshing to embody vulnerability again, to feel that progression from terrified amateur to capable survivor. Others found it frustrating after years of playing as demonstrably competent characters. Again, different competence needs seeking different validation. Resident Evil Village in 2021 continued Ethan's story while adding more action elements, creating a hybrid that attempted to satisfy both camps. The results were mixed, with some praising the balance and others feeling it committed fully to neither survival horror nor action horror. But commercially, both RE7 and Village succeeded enormously, suggesting that the competence validation Resident Evil provides remains psychologically powerful, regardless of specific mechanical implementation. The remake series, Resident Evil 2, 2019, Resident Evil 3, 2020, and Resident Evil 4, 2023, offered another fascinating psychological phenomenon. These modernized classic entries while preserving their core challenge philosophy. For older fans, the remakes provided nostalgic return to competence validation they remembered, while updating mechanics to contemporary standards. For younger players, the remakes offered first experiences with legendary entries, creating new competence bonds. Both groups found psychological satisfaction, proving that the underlying appeal transcends specific implementation. The remake of Resident Evil 2 particularly exemplified this. It maintained the original's resource scarcity and overwhelming odds while adding modern precision to combat and environmental storytelling. Players who completed the game on hardcore difficulty with S plus ranking, requiring completion within specific time limits with minimal saves, experience validation few other modern games provide. You didn't just beat a game, you mastered a system demanding enough that most players never attempt it. For competence-seeking minds, this kind of achievement provides profound satisfaction that lingers long after completion. The speedrunning community around Resident Evil games reveals another dimension of competence psychology. Speedrunners optimize routes to frame perfect precision, memorize every item location, exploit every mechanical nuance, and execute flawlessly under pressure. World record attempts require hundreds or thousands of hours of practice for runs lasting under 2 hours. This seems irrational from a cost-benefit perspective. Why invest so much time for marginal improvement in completion time? But from a competence validation perspective, it makes perfect sense. Each optimization represents capability expansion. Each execution under pressure proves reliability. Each world record, even if held briefly, represents being the best at something measurable. For people whose daily lives offer limited opportunities to be demonstrably best at anything, speed running provides space where capability can reach its highest expression and be recognized by a community that understands exactly how difficult the achievement is. The challenge run community operates similarly. Players impose artificial constraints, knife-only runs, no healing, no item boxes, no damage, that transform already difficult games into supreme tests of mastery. Completing Resident Evil 2 Remake on hardcore without taking a single hit requires encyclopedic knowledge of enemy patterns, perfect execution, and mental fortitude to maintain focus through hours-long attempts that can be ruined by one mistake. Why would anyone do this? Because proving this level of capability provides psychological validation that's rare and precious. It's not about the game anymore. It's about demonstrating to yourself and others that you're capable of extraordinary discipline, learning, and execution. The game becomes the medium through which you prove something fundamental about your capability, And for minds that need this kind of proof, completing these challenges produces satisfaction and self confidence that permeate beyond gaming. This helps explain why Resident Evil fans can seem so competitive and elitist. They're not trying to gatekeep for gatekeeping's sake. They're protecting something that provides psychological necessity. When someone says Resident Evil 4 is too easy, or the newer games are casual friendly, they're not just critiquing game design. They're expressing fear that the thing that validates their competence is being taken away, made so accessible that achievement becomes meaningless. This fear isn't entirely unfounded. As gaming has expanded to mainstream audiences, many franchises have added difficulty modes, accessibility options, and design choices that lower skill requirements. This democratizes gaming, allowing more people to experience content regardless of capability. That's objectively good for inclusivity and commercial success. But for players whose self worth is tied to capability demonstrated through mastery of difficult games, this accessibility feels like devaluation. If everyone can beat Resident Evil regardless of skill, what does beating it prove about you? This creates a psychological bind. The more accessible games become, the less validation completing them provides. So competence seeking players must constantly seek more difficult challenges, harder difficulties, self imposed restrictions, speed running, challenge runs. But these increasingly extreme demonstrations of capability create distance from casual players, reinforcing the sense of being different, demanding, perhaps broken, for needing this level of challenge just to feel adequate. The phenomenon of imposter syndrome appears frequently among dedicated Resident Evil fans, though rarely labeled as such. Despite countless hours of play, despite completing games on maximum difficulty, despite S plus rankings and speedrun records, many still feel like they're not actually good at the games. They attribute success to luck or memorization rather than skill, or the game being easier than they think. This psychological pattern emerges when external validation doesn't match internal expectations. If you need competence validation because you fundamentally doubt your capability, no amount of achievement will ever feel sufficient. You'll always find ways to minimize your accomplishments. Other people did it faster. You watched guides. You died too many times on the learning curve. The challenge isn't as pure as it used to be. This is protective self sabotage. If you never fully accept your own competence, you never have to fear losing it. You remain motivated to keep proving yourself, which maintains the validation cycle even if you can never actually feel validated. The relationship with failure also reveals psychological complexity. Resident Evil games fail you constantly, especially during initial playthroughs. You run out of resources. You save yourself into unwinnable situations. You die to bosses repeatedly. For most players, this failure is frustrating enough to quit. But for players who become devoted fans, failure becomes information. Each death teaches something. Each resource shortage reveals inefficiency. Each failed boss attempt clarifies patterns. Failure isn't defeat, it's learning. This reframing of failure as learning represents sophisticated psychological adaptation. It allows sustained engagement with difficulty that would break people who view failure as personal inadequacy, but it also creates uncomfortable parallels to how they might handle failure outside gaming. Do they apply the same learning mindset to failures in work, relationships, personal goals? Or does that same failure feel devastating rather than educational? If gaming is the only space where they've learned healthy failure response, that reveals something about where psychological growth has been possible and where it hasn't. The character relationships within Resident Evil games provide another layer of psychological significance. Chris Redfield, appearing throughout the franchise from the original game through RE8's DLC, represents sustained competence tested over time. He starts as a special tactics and rescue service member, receives advanced combat training, founds the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, and becomes one of the world's foremost experts on bioweapon threats. His character arc is about maintaining capability and purpose across decades of horror. For players who followed Chris through multiple entries, he represents aspirational continuity. He didn't survive one outbreak and retire. He committed to preventing future outbreaks, developing expertise, and dedicating his life to protecting others. This appeals to people whose competence validation isn't just about individual achievement, but sustained, meaningful application of capability. Chris represents what it might look like to take proved competence and build something purposeful from it. Leon Kennedy offers a different psychological arc. He goes from rookie cop on his first day to government agent to elite operative, but his character struggles with the toll this transformation requires. Resident Evil 4 shows him as competent but traumatized. RE6 reveals him functioning despite alcoholism and PTSD. The ID original film Damnation and Vendetta show a man who's become extraordinarily capable but has lost connections outside his work. Leon represents the cost of developed competence, what you might become if proving capability becomes your entire identity. This resonates painfully with fans who recognize themselves in Leon's trajectory. They've become exceptionally skilled at specific things through obsessive dedication, but that same dedication has isolated them. They're competent within their domain, but struggle outside it. They've proved their capability, but at cost they're only beginning to recognize. Leon doesn't offer solution or redemption, he offers recognition. You're not alone in paying this price. Jill Valentine provides yet another model. She survives the Spencer Mansion, escapes Raccoon City while pursued by Nemesis, gets captured and brainwashed by Wesker, and eventually recovers and continues fighting. Her character represents competence tested not just by external threats, but by loss of agency. When Wesker controls her, her capability becomes weapon against her allies. Her arc requires not just maintaining competence, but reclaiming it after violation. For players whose sense of capability has been undermined by forces beyond their control, mental health crises, physical illness, abusive relationships, systemic barriers, Jill's story offers specific validation. Competence can be taken from you. That violation is real. But reclaiming it slowly and with support is possible. She doesn't bounce back immediately. She has help, but she does return to fighting, and her capability matters again. This narrative arc provides hope that competence isn't permanently losable, even when it feels that way. Claire Redfield represents competence despite never choosing this life. She's a college student looking for her brother who gets caught in the Raccoon City outbreak. Unlike trained operatives, she has no specialized skills, but she survives through resourcefulness, compassion, and sheer determination. Her arc across RE2, Code Veronica, Revelations 2, and other appearances shows someone who becomes capable without losing her essential humanity and compassion. For players who feel they're being forced to develop competence they never wanted, grinding through careers they didn't choose, developing skills to survive situations they didn't create, Claire offers validation. You can become capable without it consuming your identity. You can prove you're skilled enough to survive without that becoming your entire purpose. Competence can remain tool rather than identity. The villain characters provide fascinating inverse psychology. Albert Wesker represents competence corrupted by superiority complex. He's extraordinarily capable, superhuman reflexes, genius intellect, strategic mastermind, but his competence becomes contempt for weakness, leading him to seek godhood and dismiss human value. He's a cautionary tale about competence validation becoming toxic. What happens when proving capability transforms into proving superiority? For fans who recognize their own elitism around gaming skill, Wesker represents uncomfortable mirror. Are you developing capability to improve yourself and help others? Or are you developing capability to prove you're better than others? The distinction matters enormously, and Wesker embodies the corrosive path of competence that exists only to dominate. Umbrella Corporation itself represents systemic competence without ethics. The scientists are exceptionally capable. They create viruses, engineer bioweapons, solve unprecedented biological puzzles. But capability applied without moral consideration produces horror. The entire franchise narrative critiques competence as sufficient justification. Being able to do something doesn't mean you should. Capability requires responsibility. This thematic layer adds philosophical depth that elevates Resident Evil beyond simple action horror. The games consistently ask, what is competence for? Is survival enough? Is defeating threats sufficient? Or does true capability require applying your skills toward protecting others and preventing future harm? The heroes who embody this ethic, Chris, Jill, Leon, Claire, are celebrated. The villains who lack it, Wesker, Spencer, Birkin, are condemned. For players engaging deeply with these themes, Resident Evil provides framework for thinking about their own competence validation. What are you proving capability for? Is it enough to be good at these games? Or does demonstrated competence carry responsibility to apply it meaningfully? The franchise suggests that capability without purpose becomes destructive, either to others or yourself. This philosophical dimension gives weight to what might otherwise be simple power fantasy. The weapon customization and upgrade systems, particularly prominent in RE4 and subsequent entries, create another space for competence expression. Players min-max upgrade paths, debate optimal configurations, and experiment with different loadouts to find perfect synergy between playstyle and challenge. This isn't just mechanical tinkering, it's expression of strategic thinking and long-term planning capability. Someone who's optimized their RE4 loadout for professional difficulty has demonstrated sophisticated resource economics, understanding which upgrades provide best return on investment, how to balance weapon variety against specialization, when to prioritize firepower versus ammunition efficiency. These are legitimately transferable cognitive skills. The player who can optimize Resident Evil loadouts can optimize budgets, project plans, and resource allocation in other contexts. The game provides space to develop and demonstrate these capabilities in low-stakes environment where experimentation is safe. The unlockable content and reward systems matter psychologically because they provide tiered validation. Anyone can beat the game on normal, fewer can complete hardcore, even fewer can achieve S plus rankings, and only the most dedicated unlock everything, complete all challenges, max all upgrades. This creates competence hierarchy where there's always another level to achieve, another proof of greater capability. For minds that need continuous validation, this structure provides sustainable motivation and clear metrics for measuring progress. The online community interactions around Resident Evil reveal both the positive and negative aspects of competence focused psychology. At their best, These communities celebrate achievement while helping newcomers develop skill. Experienced players share strategies, offer encouragement, and create content that helps others improve. This represents healthy competence validation, using your capability to elevate others, finding satisfaction in teaching rather than just demonstrating superiority. But at their worst, these communities become toxic gatekeeping spaces where any admission of struggle invites mockery, where asking for help brands you as casual, where accessibility features are treated as cheating. This represents unhealthy competence validation, needing others to fail so your success feels meaningful, requiring exclusivity to maintain sense of achievement, mistaking elitism for standards. The difference comes down to whether your competence validation requires others' inadequacy. Healthy validation says, I'm capable and I can help you become capable too. Toxic validation says, I'm capable and you're not, which is how I know I'm capable. One builds community and shares knowledge, the other isolates and diminishes. Both emerge from the same psychological need for competence validation, but one has processed that need healthily while the other remains trapped in comparison. Understanding this helps explain why Resident Evil discourse can become so hostile. Players aren't arguing about game mechanics, they're defending psychological necessities. When someone advocates for more accessibility options, competence seeking players hear, your achievements should mean less. When someone criticizes difficulty as artificial or unfair, they hear you're wasting time on pointless challenge. These aren't the actual arguments being made, but they're what gets heard by people for whom the games provide irreplaceable validation. The challenge for the Resident Evil community, and for individuals within it, is developing awareness of what's actually being defended and why. Are you protecting legitimate challenge that provides meaningful validation, or are you protecting exclusive difficulty that keeps others out so you can feel special? The first is healthy boundary setting. The second is gatekeeping that ultimately isolates you from potential community and reinforces the sense that your need for validation is shameful. The most psychologically healthy Resident Evil fans seem to be those who've integrated their competence validation into broader self concept. They're capable at these games, they enjoy proving it, they take satisfaction from mastery, but it's not their entire identity. They can lose, help others, celebrate accessibility features that allow more people to experience the games, because their self worth isn't exclusively tied to being better than others at Resident Evil. But reaching that integration is difficult when the games have been serving as primary source of competence validation for years or decades. It requires finding other spaces where capability matters, developing other skills that provide satisfaction, building identity components beyond gaming mastery. That's not something that happens quickly or easily, especially for people whose real world opportunities for competence validation remain limited. This is perhaps the deepest psychological complexity of loving Resident Evil. The games provide something genuinely valuable: space to develop and demonstrate capability, proof that you can handle overwhelming odds through skill and planning, validation that your competence matters. But if gaming is the only space where you receive this validation, the games become psychologically load bearing in ways that create anxiety, defensiveness, and difficulty engaging with anything outside that narrow domain. The healthiest relationship with Resident Evil, or any franchise that provides competence validation, comes from recognizing what you're getting from it and seeking similar validation through other avenues. The games have taught you resource management, pattern recognition, strategic planning, execution under pressure, healthy failure response, sustained focus, and incremental skill development. These are real capabilities with real applications. Resident Evil gave you space to develop them safely, but they're not bound to these games. They're yours to apply elsewhere. The architecture of mastery, how Resident Evil builds competent players. There's something deliberate in how Resident Evil constructs challenge that separates it from arbitrary difficulty. The games aren't hard because developers made enemies bullet sponges or limited resources randomly. They're hard because they're teaching systems mastery through carefully calibrated pressure. Understanding this instructional architecture reveals why certain minds don't just enjoy Resident Evil, they need it as a space where learning produces visible, reliable results. Every Resident Evil game operates as a tutorial in escalating competence. The opening sections introduce basic mechanics in relatively safe environments. The Spencer Mansion's first floor in the original game lets you encounter zombies one or two at a time, learn that headshots are effective, discover that conservation matters when ammunition is finite. You're not thrown into overwhelming chaos. You're being taught a language. As you progress, the game introduces complications that test whether you've internalized previous lessons. Crimson Heads in the remake of Resident Evil punish players who kill zombies without burning them. The corpses reanimate faster and more dangerous. This isn't cheap difficulty, it's teaching resource economics and risk assessment. Is this zombie in a high traffic area worth the kerosene to burn? Or can you route around it? Should you kill it at all or dodge past? Each decision has consequences that compound, teaching strategic thinking through direct experience. This pedagogical approach appeals powerfully to minds that learn kinesthetically and need immediate feedback. You try something, see the result, adjust, try again. The learning loop is clean and responsive. When you fail, you understand why. When you succeed, you know what you did right. This creates sense of control that many people lack in their educational or professional lives, where success often depends on factors beyond your influence and feedback arrives inconsistently, if at all. Resident Evil 2's geography reinforces this teaching methodology. The Raccoon City Police Department is a connected space you navigate repeatedly, learning shortcuts, unlocking new paths, understanding how different areas connect. The first time through, you're lost and overwhelmed. The 10th time, you're efficient and confident. This transformation from confused wandering to masterful navigation provides tangible proof of learning. You didn't just beat a level, you internalized a space until it became an extension of your strategic thinking. The boss encounters function as competence examinations. Each tests specific skills the game has been teaching. The first Birkin fight in RE2 teaches target prioritization and positioning. The tyrant in the original tests resource management across the entire game. Did you conserve enough heavy ammunition for this moment? Nemesis teaches real-time decision-making under pressure, fight or flight. And how do you execute either efficiently while panicked? For players who struggled in traditional education, where abstract concepts and delayed feedback made learning feel impossible, Resident Evil's concrete, immediate teaching style provides revelation. You can learn, you can master complex systems, you can improve through practice. The problem wasn't your capability. It was that most teaching methods don't match how your mind processes information. This realization can be psychologically transformative, suggesting that failures elsewhere might not indicate incapability, but pedagogical mismatch. The difficulty curves across entries reveal different philosophies about competence development. The original trilogy maintains punishing difficulty that requires accepting frequent death as part of learning. Code Veronica is notoriously unforgiving. with resource distribution that can trap players in unwinnable states if they haven't mastered efficiency. These games respect players enough to let them fail spectacularly, trusting that failure will motivate learning rather than quitting. This approach works for specific psychology, people who experience failure as challenge rather than condemnation, who have developed resilience through repeated attempts, who find satisfaction in eventual success proportional to previous failures. But it alienates players who experience failure as confirmation of inadequacy, whose resilience has been undermined by other circumstances, who need more gradual competence building. Resident Evil 4 refined the teaching model with dynamic difficulty adjustment, though this wasn't explicitly communicated to players. The game tracks performance and subtly adjusts enemy damage, aggression, and drops accordingly. Struggling players receive slight assistance. Dominating players face increased challenge. This maintains engagement across skill levels while preserving the feeling of appropriate difficulty. The psychological impact is fascinating. Players believe they're experiencing consistent challenge and attributing success to improving skill. They're not wrong. Skill does improve, but the game is also meeting them where they are, creating conditions for optimal learning. This is sophisticated instructional design disguised as entertainment, teaching complex systems mastery while maintaining the satisfaction of earned achievement. The resource management specifically functions as executive function training. You must track limited ammunition across multiple weapon types, manage healing items of different potency and inventory size, decide what to store and what to carry, plan for anticipated challenges while maintaining flexibility for unexpected threats. This requires working memory, forward planning, risk assessment, and adaptive strategy, precisely the executive functions that many people struggle with in daily life. For players with ADHD, anxiety disorders, or executive dysfunction, Resident Evil provides structured practice in these skills with clear consequences and immediate feedback. You miscalculate healing items, you die, you restart with new information, you optimize inventory configuration, you handle encounters more efficiently, you feel the satisfaction of improved execution. The game becomes therapy disguised as entertainment, building cognitive capabilities through engaging practice rather than clinical exercises. The speedrunning community reveals the ultimate expression of Resident Evil's teaching effectiveness. Speedrunners have internalized the system so completely that they can execute near perfect runs lasting hours while maintaining focus, adapting to random elements, and recovering from mistakes without catastrophic failure. This represents mastery at the highest level, unconscious competence where optimal strategies execute automatically, freeing cognitive resources for real time adaptation. Watching an expert speedrunner reveals what complete systems mastery looks like. Every movement is purposeful, every shot is calculated, every inventory management is pre planned but flexibly adjusted, every risk is assessed instantly. This is human capability at peak expression within a defined domain, and it's beautiful in the same way any mastery is beautiful, the human mind pushed to its limits and performing flawlessly. For viewers who are themselves learning, expert runs provide aspirational models. You can see what's possible, understand the gap between your current capability and theoretical maximum, and chart the path between them. This is motivating rather than discouraging because Resident Evil's teaching is transparent. You understand what the expert knows that you don't. You can identify specific skills to develop. The path to mastery is legible. This legibility of mastery matters enormously for psychological engagement. Many domains keep the path to expertise mysterious, or gate kept behind credentials and access. Resident Evil makes mastery available to anyone willing to invest time and practice. You don't need formal training, expensive equipment, or institutional approval. You need the game and dedication. This democratization of mastery appeals particularly to people who've been excluded from traditional paths to competence validation. The challenge runs and self imposed restrictions reveal another dimension of Resident Evil's teaching effectiveness. Once players have mastered the base game, they can test understanding by removing tools and forcing themselves to overcome challenges with degraded capabilities. Knife only runs test melee combat mastery and positioning. No healing runs test damage avoidance and enemy pattern knowledge. No item box runs test long term resource planning and risk management. These artificial constraints serve the same function as katas in martial arts or etudes in music, focused practice of specific skills in isolation, building unconscious competence through deliberate repetition. Players aren't just making the game harder for challenge's sake. They're using the game as training tool to develop specific capabilities to their highest expression. This is sophisticated, self-directed learning that emerges naturally from Resident Evil's teaching architecture. The community knowledge sharing accelerates individual learning curves. Detailed guides explain optimal strategies. Video tutorials demonstrate difficult sections. Community discussions compare approaches and share discoveries. This collective intelligence means no one has to learn entirely through trial and error. You can leverage community expertise to accelerate your own development, then contribute your own insights as you discover them. This creates positive learning culture where teaching is expected and valued. Experienced players take pride in helping newcomers, creating guides, explaining mechanics, and celebrating others' achievements. This represents healthy competence validation, using mastery to elevate the community rather than gatekeep it. The satisfaction comes from watching others develop capability with your assistance, validating your mastery through teaching rather than domination. But not all community interactions reflect this healthy dynamic. Some players hoard knowledge or dismiss questions as lazy, requiring newcomers to figure it out themselves as hazing ritual. This toxic expression of competence treats mastery as exclusive club rather than shared achievement. It suggests that these players' validation requires others to struggle as they did, as if helping would somehow diminish their own accomplishment. Understanding which community pattern you're participating in requires honest self-reflection. When you share strategies, are you hoping to help others succeed? Or are you hoping they'll appreciate how much you know? When someone asks for help, do you offer useful guidance? Or do you criticize them for not knowing already? The difference reveals whether your relationship with competence is healthy or corrosive. The survival instinct, Resident Evil, and fundamental human fears. Beyond competence validation, Resident Evil engages with something more primal, the survival instinct itself. The franchise's persistent appeal across 3 decades and radically different mechanical implementations suggests it's tapping into psychological needs deeper than systems mastery. It's accessing fundamental human fears about bodily vulnerability, resource scarcity, and death, then providing space to confront and overcome these fears safely. The zombie as primary antagonist carries specific psychological weight. Unlike ghosts, demons, or cosmic horrors that represent supernatural or abstract threats, zombies represent bodily degradation and death as infectious contagion. They're humans transformed into mindless consumers of other humans. They represent the fear of losing yourself, of your body becoming weapon against others, of death as communicable disease that transforms you into agent of death. This fear resonates particularly in contemporary context. Pandemic anxieties about contagion and infection, social fears about losing individuality to mob mentality, existential fears about humanity consuming itself. Zombies embody all of these simultaneously. When you shoot a zombie in Resident Evil, you're not just eliminating a threat, you're symbolically destroying the fear of becoming that threat, of losing your autonomy and identity to mindless consumption. The resource scarcity in Resident Evil maps onto survival anxieties that many people carry. The fear that there's never enough money, time, energy, security, the constant calculation of whether you can afford to spend resources now or if you should save them for anticipated crisis. The anxiety of being caught unprepared when emergency arrives, the guilt when you spend resources and then immediately encounter a situation where you desperately need what you just used. These economic anxieties pervade modern life, particularly for people experiencing or adjacent to poverty, instability, or precarity. Resident Evil transforms these anxieties into game mechanics, giving them tangible form where you can practice managing them. You learn to plan for scarcity, to optimize limited resources, to make difficult triage decisions, to live with consequences of miscalculation. And crucially, you learn that survival is possible even when resources are desperately scarce if you're skilled, strategic, and adaptable enough. This provides psychological rehearsal for real scarcity. Obviously, surviving Raccoon City with limited healing items doesn't directly prepare you for financial crisis or resource shortage, but it does provide mental models for scarcity management, prioritization, conservation, creative problem solving, maintaining function under deprivation. These cognitive patterns transfer. Someone who's mastered resource management in Resident Evil has practiced mindsets that serve real scarcity situations. The persistent threats, Nemesis hunting you, Mr. X stalking you through the police station, tyrants that won't stay dead, represent anxiety as ongoing state rather than discrete events. In psychological terms, these mechanics transform fear from acute stress, scary moment that ends, into chronic stress, ongoing threat requiring sustained vigilance. This matches how anxiety actually functions for many people, not as occasional panic, but as constant background hum of threat that never fully resolves. By making this chronic anxiety into gameplay mechanic, Resident Evil validates the experience while giving players tools to function despite it. You learn to maintain performance while constantly monitored by threats you can't permanently eliminate. You develop strategies for managing sustained pressure. You discover that you can adapt to chronic stress and continue functioning. For people living with anxiety disorders where threat feels constant, even in objectively safe environments, this represents rare validation. Yes, maintaining performance under sustained pressure is difficult, and yes, you're capable of it. The save systems using limited resources, ink ribbons in early games, tape recorders, and RE7 transform security itself into scarce resource requiring management. You must decide when safety is worth the resource cost, when to push forward without saving and risk losing progress, when uncertainty has built enough that security becomes necessary. This mechanics parallels real psychological negotiations around safety and risk. People with trauma or anxiety often struggle with security calculations, either becoming paralyzed by need for absolute safety before taking any risk, or becoming reckless with risk taking because they've lost calibrated sense of appropriate caution. Resident Evil's save mechanics provide practice space for developing this calibration. The game teaches through consequences what level of progress justifies saving, helping players develop intuition for when security is worth its cost. The safe rooms scattered through Resident Evil games provide fascinating psychological spaces. Within these rooms, enemies cannot enter. Music shifts from tense to calm. You can breathe, organize inventory, plan next steps. These spaces represent temporary respite within ongoing crisis, the brief moments of safety within overwhelmed lives where you can catch your breath before returning to demands. For players whose real lives feel like constant crisis, with insufficient respite, these safe rooms validate the need for sanctuary. They demonstrate that even in worse circumstances, creating spaces of temporary safety is legitimate and necessary. You're not weak for needing rest. Even in zombie apocalypse, the game acknowledges that survivors require sanctuaries to maintain function. This permission to rest, even briefly, can be profoundly meaningful for people who've internalized that rest is luxury they can't afford. The item boxes that allow storing resources in safe rooms and accessing them from any other safe room create another psychological layer. They represent offloading cognitive burden. You don't have to carry everything with you constantly. You can distribute resources spatially and trust they'll be available when needed. This provides practice in trusting systems and offloading tasks rather than trying to handle everything simultaneously. For people with control issues or anxiety about delegation, the item boxes teach that distributing responsibility, even to game systems, can enhance efficiency rather than create vulnerability. You're more effective when you're not carrying everything yourself, when you trust that stored resources will be available later. This lesson transfers to real life. You don't have to handle everything personally. Distributing tasks and trusting systems can actually improve outcomes. The multiple endings in various Resident Evil games, often determined by performance metrics, create interesting psychology around consequence and judgment. Your playthrough gets evaluated. Your choices and execution matter for what conclusion you receive. This can be motivating. Your performance determines outcome, but also anxiety producing. You're constantly being assessed, and judgment arrives at the end. This mirrors achievement oriented society where constant evaluation determines outcomes. For people who thrive on clear metrics and performance based results, this system feels validating. Success produces reward. But for people already struggling with perfectionism or fear of judgment, this can amplify anxiety. There's a correct ending you might fail to achieve, and you won't know until the end whether you measured up. The canonical endings that continue into sequels create additional, interesting layer. Only one ending is real, regardless of what you achieved. Leon and Claire both survive and escape Raccoon City in RE2 canon, regardless of whether your playthrough achieved that. Jill Valentine defeats Nemesis and escapes in RE3 canon. This means your performance affects your experience, but not the real story. This can be frustrating for players who want their choices to matter definitively, but it also provides psychological relief. You can't permanently ruin the story. The characters continue regardless of how you performed. This separation between your playthrough and ongoing narrative means failure, while consequential for your experience, doesn't doom the characters you care about. They survive in canon. Your failures are personal, not universal. The community of survivors, belonging through shared challenge. Perhaps the most overlooked psychological dimension of loving Resident Evil is the community it creates. These games are primarily single player experiences, yet they've generated one of gaming's most enduring and passionate communities. Understanding why reveals how shared challenge creates belonging more powerful than shared interests alone. When someone says they love Resident Evil, they're not just expressing media preference, they're identifying themselves as someone who survived specific tests. They've overcome the fear of zombies shambling toward them while ammunition runs low. They've managed scarcity and made impossible choices about resource allocation. They've died repeatedly to difficult bosses and persisted until victory. They've demonstrated capability that others haven't. This shared achievement creates bonds stronger than shared enjoyment. This is why Resident Evil fans recognize each other differently than fans of other franchises. When someone references specific challenges, the first Crimson Head encounter, fighting Verdugo in the cage in RE4, the baby monster in Village, other fans who've survived those moments feel immediate kinship. You understand what that meant. You faced that too. We both proved we were capable enough to overcome it. This mutual recognition of shared achievement creates community based on respect rather than just enthusiasm. The discourse around difficulty in Resident Evil reveals this community formation in action. When Capcom announced RE3 Remake would be shorter than RE2 Remake, veteran fans expressed concern about value. When the game released and some sections were streamlined or removed entirely, dedicated fans felt betrayed, not just disappointed, but personally invalidated. The Nemesis encounters were less persistent. The resource management was more forgiving. The game was shorter and arguably easier. For fans whose identity centered on surviving specifically challenging Resident Evil experiences, these changes felt like the franchise rejecting what made their survival meaningful. The backlash wasn't really about game length or cut content, though that's how it manifested. It was about belonging to community defined by surviving challenge and watching that challenge potentially diminish to attract broader audiences. If Resident Evil becomes easy enough that anyone can complete it, what does completing it prove about you? If the community expands to include people who haven't survived the same tests, does being part of that community still mean what it meant? These fears are simultaneously understandable and problematic. Understandable because challenge based belonging is legitimate and meaningful. People who've achieved difficult things should feel proud and recognized. Problematic because defining community through exclusion ultimately isolates you. If only people who've beaten RE2 Remake on hardcore S plus rank are real fans, you've created a community so exclusive that it barely exists, and you've rejected potential peers who might enhance your experience. The healthiest Resident Evil communities manage this tension by creating tiered belonging. There's space for casual fans who enjoy the games without pursuing mastery, newcomers still developing skills, dedicated players pursuing challenge runs, speedrunners optimizing execution, and everyone in between. Achievement is celebrated at all levels without requiring maximum difficulty completion to be considered legitimate. This inclusive approach builds larger, more diverse communities while still honoring the special recognition that comes with difficult achievements. But toxic communities gatekeep aggressively, treating casual enjoyment as contamination and accessibility as betrayal. These spaces become hostile to newcomers, dismissive of anyone not pursuing maximum difficulty, and bitter about any franchise evolution that makes games more approachable. This creates insular echo chambers where the same hardcore fans reinforce each other's increasingly rigid standards until they're alienated from broader gaming culture and even from Resident Evil itself as it evolves. Understanding which community pattern you're participating in requires examining how you respond when someone says they're playing on assisted or normal difficulty? Do you dismiss them as not really experiencing the game, or do you celebrate that they're engaging with the franchise at all and might develop interest in higher difficulties later? The first response protects exclusive achievement but alienates potential community. The second builds inclusive community but might feel like achievement is being devalued. There's no perfect solution to this tension. Some amount of exclusivity is inherent to achievement based community. If completing difficult challenges is meaningful, then not everyone will complete them, which creates hierarchy. But the question is whether that hierarchy is respected difference in achievement level within a larger community, or whether it's used to exclude people from community entirely. The first is healthy, the second is toxic. The content creators and streamers within Resident Evil community play interesting role in this dynamic. Skilled players who showcase expert play, explain strategies, and help others improve represent aspirational models. They demonstrate what's possible while making that possibility feel achievable through teaching. They use their mastery to build community upward, elevating others toward greater capability. But creators who showcase skill primarily to demonstrate superiority, who mock struggling players or dismiss accessibility features, who gatekeep and exclude, use their mastery to push community downward, establishing hierarchy where they remain on top by keeping others below. Both types of creators attract audiences, but they build very different community cultures around the franchise. For individual fans, choosing which content to engage with shapes your own relationship to the franchise and community. Are you watching creators who inspire you to improve and offer strategies to help you succeed? Or are you watching creators who make you feel inadequate unless you achieve their level of mastery? The first is healthy relationship to aspirational content. The second reinforces toxic achievement anxiety. The phenomenon of challenge runs being recorded and shared creates fascinating community dynamic. These runs, knife only, no healing, professional difficulty with restrictions, push mastery to extreme levels. They represent the absolute highest expression of capability within the franchise, but they serve different psychological functions for different viewers. For some, watching challenge runs inspires their own skill development. They see what's possible, understand the techniques required, and feel motivated to improve their own play. The runs demonstrate that mastery is achievable through practice and strategic thinking. This is healthy engagement that uses expert performance as teaching tool. For others, watching challenge runs reinforces inadequacy. They see the gap between expert performance and their own capability and feel discouraged rather than motivated. The runs demonstrate how far they are from real mastery. This is unhealthy engagement that uses expert performance as evidence of personal insufficiency. The difference often comes down to whether you have growth mindset, capability develops through effort, or fixed mindset, capability is inherent trait. Growth mindset viewers see challenge runs and think, I could develop those skills through practice. Fixed mindset viewers see challenge runs and think, I'll never be that good, so why bother? The content is identical. The psychological frame determines whether it's inspiring or demoralizing. Resident Evil community, at its best, promotes growth mindset through celebration of improvement at all levels. Someone posting their first ever completion on normal difficulty receives congratulations and encouragement. Someone achieving their first hardcore completion receives celebration. Someone hitting new speedrun personal record receives respect, regardless of whether it's near world record time. The focus is on personal improvement and progression rather than comparison to absolute maximum performance. At its worst, The community becomes toxic with fixed mindset comparison, where only elite performance receives respect and anything less receives dismissal or mockery. This creates an environment where struggling players feel unwelcome, where asking for help invites ridicule, where accessibility features are treated as cheating, where you must already be good to be accepted into spaces that could help you become good. This toxic dynamic ultimately undermines the community by excluding the next generation of skilled players before they develop their capabilities. The psychological future, what Resident Evil teaches about ourselves. After 3 decades, dozens of entries, and millions of players, Resident Evil has become more than franchise. It's a psychological phenomenon that reveals fundamental truths about human needs for competence, mastery, challenge, and belonging. Understanding the psychology of people who love Resident Evil illuminates not just video game fandom, but human motivation itself. We are creatures who need to prove our capability. This isn't vanity or insecurity, it's fundamental human psychology. We need evidence that we matter, that we can affect outcomes, that our skills and efforts produce results. For much of human history, this validation came naturally through survival itself. You demonstrated competence through successfully hunting, farming, building, defending. Your capability was visible and consequential. Modern life has abstracted most capability demonstrations. We work jobs where results are distant from effort. We spend money on goods produced by people we'll never meet. We consume entertainment created by enormous corporate structures. Our individual capability feels increasingly irrelevant to outcomes. This creates psychological hunger for spaces where capability matters visibly and immediately. Resident Evil provides this space. Your skill determines whether you survive. Your planning determines whether you have resources when you need them. Your learning determines whether you overcome challenges that initially seemed impossible. Your capability produces measurable results. This isn't simulation or pretense. Within the game's context, your competence genuinely matters, and that validation, even in fictional context, provides psychological sustenance that contemporary life often denies. The people who love Resident Evil most intensely are often people for whom this validation is scarcest elsewhere. Maybe their work feels meaningless or their efforts go unrecognized. Maybe they face systemic barriers that prevent capability from translating to opportunity. Maybe they have disabilities or circumstances that limit where they can demonstrate mastery. Maybe they're young and haven't yet had chances to prove themselves. Or maybe they're simply built with deep need for competence validation that isn't satisfied by conventional paths. For all these people, Resident Evil isn't just entertainment, it's psychological necessity. It's proof that they're capable when everything else suggests inadequacy. It's validation that their competence matters when society implies it doesn't. It's demonstration that they can learn, grow, overcome, that they're not fundamentally insufficient, but rather that they needed appropriate challenge to reveal their capability. This is why criticism of Resident Evil can feel so personal to devoted fans. You're not just critiquing a game, you're questioning the thing that proved their worth when nothing else did. You're dismissing the validation they desperately needed. You're suggesting that the achievement that matters most to them is actually trivial or meaningless. The defensive reaction isn't disproportionate from their perspective. It's protecting something psychologically load-bearing that can't be replaced. Understanding this psychology doesn't mean critics should withhold legitimate analysis. Resident Evil games have flaws. The franchise has made missteps. No entertainment is above criticism. But it does mean approaching critique with awareness that for some audience members, you're discussing something far more significant than entertainment preference. For them, you're discussing the thing that validated their capability. Handle that with appropriate care. For the fans themselves, understanding this psychology creates opportunity for growth. If Resident Evil is providing validation you can't find elsewhere, that suggests something about your life that might need addressing. The games aren't the problem, they're a solution to problem that exists outside gaming. What would it look like to find competence validation through other avenues? What barriers prevent you from demonstrating capability in other domains? What would need to change for gaming to be meaningful hobby rather than psychological necessity? These aren't easy questions, and the answers often involve circumstances beyond individual control. Systemic barriers, economic constraints, health limitations, social circumstances. These factors genuinely restrict where people can demonstrate and receive validation for competence. Recognizing that Resident Evil fills psychological need doesn't automatically create other options for meeting that need, but awareness itself provides value. Understanding what you're getting from these games helps you seek similar validation where possible and make conscious choices about your relationship with the franchise. You can appreciate that Resident Evil proved your capability while also working toward building life where that's not the only space where your competence matters. You can honor what the games have given you while also recognizing the limitations of deriving primary validation from any single source. The franchise itself continues evolving, navigating the tension between maintaining the challenge that creates meaningful achievement and expanding accessibility to reach broader audiences. Each new entry faces impossible task of satisfying both longtime fans who need significant challenge to feel validated and newcomers who need appropriate onboarding to develop interest. No single design can perfectly serve both constituencies. The remake series and the mainline entries like RE7 and Village represent different approaches to this challenge. The remakes honor original design philosophy while modernizing mechanics, primarily serving existing fans who want nostalgia combined with contemporary quality. The new mainline entries take greater risks with new directions, attempting to attract new audiences while maintaining franchise identity. Both approaches are necessary for Resident Evil to continue existing. Pure nostalgia serves diminishing audience, while abandoning core identity alienates the passionate fans who sustained the franchise through its rough periods. For fans, the challenge is accepting that Resident Evil will continue changing, and that's not betrayal but survival. Franchises that don't evolve die. The Resident Evil you need might not be the Resident Evil that maintains commercial viability. This is painful reality, but it's reality nonetheless. You can continue finding value in existing entries that meet your needs, while accepting that new entries might serve different audiences. You can celebrate when new games align with your preferences while not treating departures as attacks. You can be fan who makes space for franchise evolution rather than demanding it remain frozen in the form that first validated you. The broader lesson is that no external validation source remains static. The thing that proves your capability today might change tomorrow. Building resilient sense of competence requires multiple validation sources so that when one changes or becomes unavailable, your entire self-worth doesn't collapse. Resident Evil can be one source, even primary source currently, without being the only source you ever develop. The healthiest relationship to Resident Evil, or any competence validation source, is gratitude combined with self-awareness. Gratitude for what it provided when you needed it, awareness of what psychological function it serves, recognition of both its value and its limitations, appreciation for the community it creates without letting that community become your only source of belonging, pride in achievements without requiring others' failure to make those achievements meaningful. This balanced relationship is difficult to achieve, particularly when the franchise has been psychologically essential, but it represents maturity, the ability to value something deeply without being consumed by it, to achieve greatly without defining yourself entirely through achievement, to belong to community without requiring it to be exclusive, to demonstrate capability without needing to prove superiority. The people who love Resident Evil aren't damaged or broken. They're human beings meeting fundamental psychological needs through the tools available to them. They've found something that validates their competence in a world that often fails to provide that validation. They've built communities around shared achievement in society that increasingly atomizes and isolates. They've developed skills through practice and dedication in an environment that rewards capability with measurable results. These are healthy responses to real psychological needs. The question isn't whether loving Resident Evil indicates something wrong with you. The question is whether your relationship with the franchise is balanced and sustainable, whether it's enhancing your life or limiting it, whether you're using it as one tool among many or depending on it exclusively. For the millions who found meaning in Raccoon City's ruins, Spencer Mansion's corridors, and the countless bioterror nightmares across 3 decades of games, you're not alone. Others understand the satisfaction of perfect inventory optimization, the pride of conquering difficulty that seemed impossible, the validation of demonstrating capability others couldn't match. That understanding creates community. That shared experience builds connection. That mutual recognition of achievement matters. Your love of Resident Evil reveals something true about human psychology. We need challenge, we need mastery, we need proof that we're capable. These games provide that proof. They create space where competence matters visibly and immediately. They validate capabilities that contemporary life often fails to recognize. That's not trivial, that's not shameful, that's deeply human. The fog that settles around people who love Silent Hill is introspective and psychological. The adrenaline that courses through people who love Resident Evil is competitive and validating. Both are legitimate responses to horror. Both serve real psychological needs. Neither is superior. They're different medicines for different conditions. If you're someone who needs Resident Evil, who finds validation through mastery, who proves capability through challenge, who demonstrates competence through achievement, know that this need is legitimate. You're not broken for requiring this validation. You're human. And you found something that meets a need many others share but struggle to articulate. The Spencer Mansion, Raccoon City, the village in RE4, the Baker Estate, Castle Dimitrescu. These aren't just game environments, they're proving grounds, places where you demonstrated something about yourself that mattered, where you showed capability others couldn't match, where you survived. And survival, whether in fiction or reality, is always meaningful. It always matters. It always counts. You survived. You proved it. And that's enough.